Hello, everyone, and welcome to Bocconi University Executive Chat Live, an executive chat which is dedicated to the impact of the pandemic on economics, business, and overall the society. We have discussed so far the impact of coronavirus on universities. We have discussed the impact on life sciences and the health system. This evening, we're going to discuss how this pandemic is impacting another fundamental sector of the economy, which is news and more generally the publishing industry. As usual, we will have two guests, and we will try to use also some of the questions that will come from you in order to have an interaction in the next 40 minutes. So let me get started to anticipate that we have two privileged guests this evening, and I would like to thank them very much. And let me first introduce in alphabetical order from New York, Gerard Baker, who is the editor-at-large of the Wall Street Journal.
Buonasera, buongiorno da New York City. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you, Jerry. And Jerry has worked as a correspondent for television and radio and wrote for some of the most important journals, including the Financial Times and the Times of London. He was Dow Johnson managing editor, and between 2013 and 2018, he has been the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal. So thank you very much, Jerry, for being with us. Yeah. And we also introduce the other guests. We are also we have the pleasure of having tonight the newly appointed editor-in-chief of La Repubblica, Maurizio Molinari.
Thank you very much for having me.
And Maurizio Molinari is a super prolific book writer with extremely interesting monographs written between 2000 and 2015. And before joining Repubblica as editor-in-chief, he was editor-in-chief of La Stampa since 2015. And before that, he's been correspondent from many regions of the world, from the US, from Jerusalem, from Brussels for La Stampa. So thank you so much for being with us. And let's get started with the first question on the business model of publishing. And so let me ask Jerry, what COVID-19 represented. It has been a disruptive force for many areas of the economy. It has been disruptive for universities with distance learning, for most of the corporations with smart working. What about the news and the publishing industry specifically?
Well, it's been a dramatic period for us. Obviously, I mean, since the middle of March, everybody at the Wall Street Journal, in common, I'm sure, with news organizations, with people around the world, we've been essentially working from home. We've been putting the newspaper out in digital form and in print form, with 95% of our employees working from home. It's been an extraordinary effort, and we've managed to do that and do it very effectively. There have been two, I suppose, major effects from the point of view of the business model. The first is the good news in this very grim climate. The good news for us is that there has been a surge of interest in people wanting to have quality news, reliable news and information about what's going on. There's been a massive increase in traffic to our website, and particularly for us, what's most important is we've seen an enormous increase in subscriptions. As you know, Gianmario, our digital service is subscription only. Pretty well all of our content up till the virus has been behind a paywall. Now, because of the virus, we did choose to make a lot of our content available for free. But even with that content, that virus-related content available for free, we've seen a massive increase in our total subscriptions, in our circulation. People paying to read the Wall Street Journal. Our subscriptions actually just this week went up through 3 million. That's been an increase in the last year alone of about 10%. So we've seen a big increase in people paying for our content, which is obviously good news for us. Obviously, the flip side of that is that advertising, which is an important but less important part these days of our business revenue, advertising has fallen sharply. Advertisers are very reluctant, obviously, to spend money right now. They're uncertain about the future. They know that people aren't spending a lot of money right now, so there isn't a lot of point in them advertising. So advertising has fallen sharply. But that's a picture. So what I would say is the COVID-19 crisis has kind of accelerated the two main trends in our business model that have been going on for the last 10 or 15 years, which is a big increase in circulation, a big increase in the number of people paying subscribers to read the Wall Street Journal content, and a continuing decline in advertising revenue.
That's extremely interesting, and I would like to ask a similar question with a contextualization on Europe and Italy to Director Molinari, because basically, we were far in terms of digitalization of papers, and so the question is, what happened in the case of Italy, and in your view, what happened in continental Europe in general?
Yes, Gianmario. That was a crucial moment, I believe, for information industry and the whole sector in Italy. When COVID started, there was this public mood about the need of information. People were so surprised by the attack by an invisible enemy that they needed information all around. They were forced to stay home, and they needed basically two kinds of goods, food and information. The consequence of this was that they went to their website, went to the laptop, and tried to get as much information as possible. I have to say that the smart and important and strategic decision taken by the government not to close the newsstand allowed many people still to go out to buy the newspaper in print at the newsstand closest to their homes. This was a crucial and very important decision that allowed also to the paper product not only to survive, but to have an incredible and unpredictable season of 2 months of extraordinary life. People went out, also old people went out to take the paper, to bring the paper home. And old people were remembering listening to Radio Londra during the war, and they were making this comparison. It was a war, we were under attack, we need good information. So for the newspapers all around the spectrum was a great occasion in terms of legitimizing the crucial need, the strategic importance of news and information, reliable, quality information in time of crisis. And exactly as Jerry said, here also we experienced a very big request and demand about digital news subscriptions. There was a big jump in subscription, especially by young people, but also families in numbers that we really didn't expect. Now the challenge is to keep them and speaking not only about the virus, but also other topics. And as well as in US, also in Europe, and especially in Italy, we had a terrific drop in advertising. My personal experience, when I saw how much the advertising was going down, I did try to reach out some of the biggest companies, try to ask them. And I went to them, I said, look, we have an increasing number of readers, both on paper and digital. So why you drop the advertising? This is exactly the moment people stay home. They have more time to read, to stay online on our website. Why you fly away? Why you go away? And the answer was stunning, because this company told me, Maurizio, we understand that this is the phenomenon, but we don't want to appear to link with our image to news that are related to a negative topic. So we're very sorry. You have a larger circulation and more readers online, but we cannot do more advertising in this moment. So yes, we had a terrific moment in terms of popularity, a tragic numbers in terms of advertising. But I want to say that the most important point here to say is that the readers, the audience at large, felt the need for news, and for all of us, this was a really positive surprise.
Gianmario, if I could very quickly just chime in with one observation, and I agree with everything that Maurizio said, particularly about the attitude of advertisers. But I do think that one question mark for us, for all of us, is what will happen to print circulation in the long run here. We, as you know, the Wall Street Journal, the vast majority of our subscribers are digital subscribers, but we still have close to 1 million, about 800,000 print subscribers around the country. And it's somewhat different from the European system. Most people who buy the Wall Street Journal in print get it delivered to their home address, a very small number of newsstand sales. Most of those people have continued to get the journal, but there has been significant disruption, as you would expect, to the print copy of the journal. A lot of people have not been getting it. A lot of people have been going away from their homes, so they've cancelled it. We're going to have to wait and see as things start to reopen, as they are reopening now in the United States. We're going to have to see what happens to those people's demand for the print edition. I think what we'll have discovered is a lot of them, I think, will have migrated to digital. People, especially older people who perhaps had not really thought about using digital devices before, have done that. And we'll have to see. We're hopeful that most of that print circulation will resume. But I think we are aware that there may be a reluctance of some people, to continue to get the paper in physical print form. And that may be another way in which this crisis accelerates the changes that we're seeing in our business.
This makes a lot of sense.
Gianmario, if I may add something else about how we did reorganize the newsroom, because this may be something important to share with our viewers. In the moment that we understood how much aggressive was the virus and how much dangerous was for journalists to come to the newsroom, we took the decision more or less to keep inside the newsroom less than 25% of the people. So 75% stayed home. And this was the beginning of the smart working in the newsroom. And actually, I have to say, after more than 2 months, that this experiment worked quite well. Because to have a lighter newsroom with less people working in the headquarters, this gives to the organization as a whole more flexibility. And also, speaking about the reporters or people that work at the desk but in remote, so from their houses, actually they worked quite well. And people that they were good worked better, and people that are not good simply disappeared. So in reality, in terms of how the virus, the COVID-19 impact in our inside organization, inside the newsroom, in reality, it's teaching us that the smart working may have positive effect.
This is very interesting because, in fact, digital is about also efficiency, not only effectiveness, and that for sure is the case, I assume, for many corporations to see that sometimes, we need social interactions. Of course, this is crucial part of our life, but sometimes it's also a little bit inefficient, and the number of meetings that we run when we are physically present probably is even higher than what should be. Let me get to see, given that Jerry said buongiorno at the beginning, Jerry, you know that in Italy, the classic thing is to have a cappuccino in the morning and to buy the paper, right? So I was curious, linking to this point with Maurizio, are also numbers, not of course similar to the US, because there is a lag here in the digitalization, but do you also think that in the future there will still be a niche or probably a bigger market for papers, like Jerry said, for the case of the US?
I think, no, I think one of the many things that's going to change as a result of this is there's going to be less of that kind of, well, certainly immediately and in the immediate future, less of that social interaction and less of a demand for people. We've seen here in the United States and around the world, an explosion of people undertaking digital activity, buying things online, reading things online, watching things online. Again, all of these things that people were doing in greater numbers have just been dramatically accelerated. And I think, look, of course, we're human beings. We have a need for social interaction. I've been stuck here at home in New York City for the last 2 months, 2.5 months now. I haven't been out for dinner because the restaurants have been closed for almost 3 months. I can't wait to go out and find a restaurant, actually have dinner, lots of really good Italian restaurants here, not quite as good as you have in either Milan or Rome, obviously, but we have a good number in New York City. I can't wait to go out there and experience it. But I do think that as much as people will still want to do that, They've got into the habit of doing things digitally. Again, whether it's buying things, I think the retail sector in the US is being devastated. Huge numbers of retail companies have going out of business. They've gone bankrupt in this crisis. That will be a permanent change. And I think one of the things that will change is the physical experience of getting the paper for a lot of, look, it'll be there for a lot of people. And again, here in the United States, people tend to have their newspapers delivered to their home address. So many of those people will go on doing that. But there will undoubtedly be a significant reduction in the number of people wanting to consume news that way, in a physical way, with a physical product, just as there will be I think a decline in their willingness to shop in traditional stores, to go to cinemas, to go to theaters. I think that is going to be a big, significant step change.
Absolutely. And Maurizio, what is your take on this?
Yes, I believe that the boost that we saw, it's a step that very difficult. We will go back from that. I mean, I was impressed, especially by one data. In the second month of the COVID experience in Italy, the percentage of exchange of goods on the web touched 80% of the total. Now, for a country like Italy that was lagging very much behind in terms of digital development and a customer behaving, this was a big step forward. And so I believe that a lot will stay in terms of habits, also because we don't have to forget that the fear is going to stay with us until the vaccine will be there. Since we will need another several months until we have the vaccine, it means that on the behavior of the customer, probably some of these new habits will stay.
Absolutely. So let me quote the CEO of Microsoft, Satya Nadella, who said that these 2 months have been 2 years of digital transformation in terms of production and consumption. So for sure, this is something irreversible. Let me get back to a point that you both made. So let me ask Jerry. So you mentioned, actually even Maurizio, the quality of news, the fact that people were, of course, looking for finally for news that is also scientific, I would say, because there has been a lot of science in these days. And paradoxically, we have been living in the last few years the rise of fake news with the social networks. And so do you think that this attitude in the future will change? And in general, the opportunity to report more scientific and fact-related news will remain for good or not?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think there are two things actually which point in perhaps different directions. On the one hand, again, we've seen, I'm proud to say, the Wall Street Journal, we get very high levels of trust generally when people are asked, when surveys are taken, which news organizations people trust in this country, and very large numbers of them say they do trust what's in the Wall Street Journal. And that's been reflected in a big increase in people coming to our website, and a big increase in people subscribing to the Wall Street Journal online, because they really want that information in an age when, as you say, Gianmario, everything from, touting certain cures for coronavirus from certain people, suggesting that certain drugs are good, certain behaviors are good. In the UK, you had a kind of sort of ridiculous conspiracy theory about cell phone towers and what they were doing to contribute. So there was a lot of false information out there, as there has been for a while. And I think quality news organizations like ours, like Maurizio's, I think are doing well because people need that information. I think working perhaps in the other direction, and I worry a bit about this, I do think one of the things we've seen in the United States, and I follow the UK very closely too. I'm originally British, although I've lived here for a long time, but I write for a UK paper and I do other things there too. In these two countries in particular, I think where some people thought that maybe the onset of this crisis might lead to might create a more unified political environment. People might come together to fight the virus, and maybe the incredible partisanship we've seen over Donald Trump and Brexit in the UK over the last 3 or 4 years, maybe that would go away or at least reduce. I think if anything, the partisanship has actually increased. If you follow the debate here in the United States or what's going on in the UK right at the moment, there is an intense, vitriolic, quite vicious aggressive on both sides. Here in the United States, half the people blame Donald Trump for what's happened. The other half blame either China or the media or somebody else. And I think one of the worrying things for media is that there's a tendency for news media, like all of us, to actually be pushed further and further in a partisan direction. And we are becoming, here in the United States and in the UK, and I think it's true in other parts of Europe too, we're becoming more and more people who just choose information from the political side of the aisle that suits us. That, if I'm a liberal, I want the New York Times' coverage or what's going on CNN. If I'm a conservative, I want the Wall Street Journal or Fox News. And I think, unfortunately, and perhaps slightly surprisingly, the COVID-19 epidemic has actually accentuated those tendencies.
Oh, it's very interesting. And so this is something that I would like also to hear the opinion of Director Molinari. So you think that something similar happened in Italy?
Look, I believe we have some differences here. What happened in Italy was that in the first phase, that was the sanitary emergency phase, basically the country gathered around the government. Even if this is politically speaking, in terms of majority in parliament, a weak government, even if it's a prime minister that entered the COVID crisis with a not so high level of popularity in the polls, the reality is that when he started to lead and to take also very difficult decision, asking people to stay home for 2 months, to limit the movements and completely change the daily life. The reality is that most of the Italians abide to this regulation, agreed with the decision taken by the prime minister and the government, and the popularity of the prime minister rose. So, politically, we learned that Italy is a land of surprises. And in this case, I believe the Italians surprised themselves very much. The political crisis re-entered the stage only when the sanitary emergency did wind down, and we entered in the economic emergency. That was the second phase of the crisis. And at that moment, when the government started to take decisions about the economy, then yes, the polemics, the attacks, the debate, the hard debate came back. But until that moment, in reality, the country was rallying around the prime minister.
That's very interesting. And let me say another difference between the two countries is that, US is very close to the election. Instead, in Italy, we are constantly under election, I would say. So we have learned over the years that any government might fail very soon. So probably we have learned, and so we were more focused on the pandemic itself without any political compromise. That's very interesting. And going back to Gerard Baker, we have seen several times Dr. Fauci close to Donald Trump. In general, science has become all of a sudden very close to politics. This is true, of course, also in Italy, with the virologists and epidemiologists being the new stars of the talk shows and the newspaper and also the report on TV. So even this thing will last for long, or is just for the pandemic? And I'm not saying, of course, the medical doctors, but in general, will science be contributing to politics in the future, in your view, more than it did in the past, or not?
I mean, I think we need to be careful when we talk about science. And you're right. Dr. Fauci has become this national star, good Italian American, of course, New Yorker, Italian, good Italian, flying the flag there for Italian Americans and doing, generally speaking, regarded as a very good job. I do think one of the we have become one of the dangers again of this partisanship that I was talking about is that science, science is being exploited on both sides for political reasons. I mean, there's no better example of that than this argument here that we've had in the United States over the last couple of months. And I don't know to what extent you or the viewers have followed this, but there's been a significant argument in the United States about whether to use the drug hydroxychloroquine as a treatment, for COVID-19. This is a topic that is surely not one that should be about politics. I mean, a drug either works on a patient or it doesn't. It has side effects. It works for some patients. It doesn't work for other patients. It shouldn't be your position on whether or not you support this drug shouldn't be a political one, but it's become a political issue. It's become, you know, you can now tell whether somebody supports Donald Trump or not by whether or not they actually think again, they're not scientists. They haven't got a clue how this drug works, but whether or not, you know, if you're in favor of hydroxychloroquine, then you're a Trump supporter. If you're against it, then you're not. And so I worry a little bit. And part of the problem here is, so I think, firstly, science is becoming subordinated to politics. And secondly, and again, this is where we need to be cautious, is, you know, the science, everybody says, oh, the science, as though there is one agreed scientific truth that everybody accepts and that some people are following and some people are just refusing to follow. You know, the Republicans here are often accused of being anti-science. I think, to be fair, there isn't an agreed scientific view, right, on all kinds of things related to this. There are so many things we don't know about this epidemic. We don't know why certain people get it and other people don't. We don't know why certain people get worse symptoms while some people die. We don't know what kind of drugs actually really are effective. Some drugs seem to be effective, some drugs aren't. We don't know, you know, how quickly this thing spreads. We don't, as we're in the United States right now, we're going through this big argument about lifting the lockdowns. The truth is, we don't, you know, and there are some people saying very forcefully, we've got to lift the lockdown, we've got to lift the lockdown. It's, you know, we've flattened the curve, we've gone beyond the first stage, and now we've got to get the economy going. Others are saying, no, we've got to keep people at home, we've got to keep people at home. We don't know. The truth is, we don't know. There isn't one agreed upon scientific consensus on any of these issues. So I think, while, again, politicians like to say, oh, I'm following the science, there are, you know, of course, one day we will know there is, I believe, such a thing as objective truth. One day we will be able to understand, we'll have answers to all these questions. Right now, the science is not fixed. It is evolving rapidly. And that is leading to people, I think, you know, using science for their own ends and saying, this is what the science says, we should do this. Well, actually, the science is complicated, and it may not. Epidemiology is a good example of that. There are epidemiologists, as you well know, as we all know, who say we've got to stay, you know, we've got to lock down the economies, we've got to stay at home, you know, stop the virus, protect our healthcare. And there are others who say, actually, no, that's, you know, the virus is going to spread eventually. We've got to get it out there. We've got to take care of the sick. We've got to isolate those who are vulnerable. But we can't just think that we're going to be able to kill this virus by keeping everybody at home. So I think that's the danger here, that there is a, you know, people like to use the word science as though it, you know, there's just one objective scientific truth, when in fact there are many, many different scientific procedures, methods, and theories at the moment that I think we, you know, we need to look more deeply at.
This is absolutely important, and I would like to hear the opinion also of Maurizio with this, because basically even in Italy we are used, you know, to, of course, to have facts, empirics, but oftentimes the rappers use a lot of the rhetoric, and so in continental Europe we are very much used to a narrative which is slightly different. In this case, it's been more fact-driven, more data-driven, but at the same time there has been a lot of debate because, as Jerry was saying, you know, there are scientists and scientists. There is sometimes good science and not very good science. And so what is your take on this, Maurizio, for Italians?
I believe it's important to recollect what happened in this country in the last 2 months on this topic, because it was dramatically new since the very beginning. The scientists were the main characters on the stage. They were everywhere, suggesting everything all the time. And they were the people that the prime minister trusted the most. They were gathered in several committees, and they were actually influencing or dictating, if you want to say, the line of the government. The hard line the government took came from them. So we had doctors, academics, virologists, whose names were not known, that suddenly became very popular, including a daily bulletin at 6 p.m. in the afternoon, where they were actually summarizing what was going on. They were the generals of the crisis. And they kept the stage until the end of the first phase, at the end of the sanitary crisis. But here and then came up as they became suddenly a problem. Because until the crisis was hard and we had to fight against the virus, and the need was to face this invisible enemy and to decide the rules to be safe at home, they were completely in charge, and nobody was objecting mostly anything to what they were saying, including the prime minister. But then, when the situation started to change and the government had to begin to face the economy agenda, when to reopen, how to restart, to take completely different kind of decision. So they started becoming a kind of burden, because the hardline was not compatible with the time of the reopening. So the discussion that we started having, and in some parts still have, is the balance between the economic advisors and the scientist advisor. And this was completely new for this country.
Sure, absolutely. And Jerry, there is a question from the audience which remarks the fact that the coronavirus has been a sort of equalizer in terms of impact, but then it impacted particularly, of course, senior people, and in countries like the US, where there is not a, let's say, a public health system, also people that do not have the means to support a good health system. So what are you seeing from New York and from the United States in general?
So I do think, and this is one of the big contrasts, I think, between the United States and other countries, is the US is as you know, is a very much a federal system, and meaning there is enormous power in the states. And so, whereas, in a country like Italy or the United Kingdom or France, say unitary, big countries, but they tend, the government in Rome or in Paris or in London can say, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, we're going to pursue this policy with regards to, isolation or quarantine or whatever, and it happens. The United States is 50 different jurisdictions with 50 different sets of authorities that did things in 50 different ways. I mean, quite literally, with 50 different, types of healthcare system even. So I think one of the things we've seen, and it's really important to remember when people look at the United States and say, we've just passed 100,000 deaths tragically this week. That's the highest number in the world. I mean, proportion of population, it's a little bit behind Italy and France and Spain and the UK, but still, it's still a very, very, very high number. But it's really important when you look at that to know, just as much of the crisis in Italy was focused in northern Italy and Lombardy in particular, New York has been the locus of this. The New York area has been the locus of this crisis in the United States. I wrote about this quite recently. The New York area, parts of New Jersey, parts of Connecticut, here in the northeast of the United States, accounts for almost half of the total deaths in the United States as a whole. That is an area that accounts for less than 10% of the population, accounting for half of the deaths. So when we come to look and try to understand what happened here, take a state like California. California has more than twice as many people in residents as New York does, and it's had about less than 1/10 of the cases. So people are going to have to look really hard at what conditions, demographic, economic, the state of the healthcare system, what policy decisions were made, when lockdown decisions were made, the kind of lockdown decisions were made, how people in care homes were treated. A huge number of the deaths here have been in, again, as I know is the case in Italy, have been elderly in care homes. People are going to need to look at we're going to have a really interesting scientific experiment here, because we're going to have 50 different cases 50 different experiences in the United States. And again, really, if you take New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut out of the picture, the rest of the United States has so far had a very, very small incidence of this pandemic, really tiny, down, per head of population, roughly on the level of Germany. So I think we're going to have to understand. We're going to spend a lot of time trying to understand what went wrong here in New York, in particular. Maybe what went right for other parts of the country, and try to learn some lessons from that.
Which I guess, Maurizio, is very similar to what we have to do in Italy, right? Because even here, if you exclude the Lombardy, the cases are really limited. Northern Italy, of course, Veneto and Piedmont are also pretty much into COVID, but the big portion is Lombardy, with instead, differently from the US, a public system and one of the top system in continental Europe in terms of health. So how do you see this crisis for the evidence that we have collected so far?
Well, Gianmario, as you know, my home is still in Milan, even if I left it on March 1st, and I haven't been back yet. And I have been working for a long time in Turin, and now I'm in Rome, so I saw the difference. There is no question that the north was hit at the hardest in Italy. This was Lombardy, Piedmont, part of Veneto region, and the northern of Emilia-Romagna. That was the war zone. That was the ground zero of the war on pandemics that the Italians fought. And that's where most of the damage was caused, most of the death we had. And this is, by the way, the area where the sanitary system is the best that we have in this country. So why this happened? I believe that we have to look at this really as a surprise attack. I mean, after the surprise attack in history, we learned things that we didn't know. This was after Pearl Harbor, this was after September 11, it was after Yom Kippur War. Pandemics is an attack. It's a surprise attack against a society, against a democracy. Now, the democracy react according to the means, the custom, the behavior, the tools that they have. And in fact, the trenches of Lombardy, they hold it up, but with a lot of victims. We will have to study hard what happened. And I believe that the first point, the most crucial piece of information that we have to start from this rethinking and study is that health became, for all of us, an element of national security. We have been used to consider national security something that had to do with army, with cyber, but health, now we know that is part of it, because when you have to defend people from invisible army and enemies, so it means that we have to change the way that we look at defense. And so hospitals and doctors are crucial to defending the social the society to which we belong. And this is the basic change that we have to face. And this is also has to do with investment, budget laws, and really a test of leadership for our leaders.
That's absolutely true, and it shows also the complexity of the problems of the global society, I would say, because as you said, it's really an interlink between medical problems and organizational and logistics problem, which at the very beginning were really the bottleneck in solving the situation. And Jerry, may I ask you the reputation of Italy from the US, how it changed? Because as you can imagine, being Italy, the first Western country hit by this, and particularly this area, which has lived a sort of new renaissance in the last 10 years, we were super concerned to be considered all of a sudden, the center of negative news. So what is the news over there and the reputation change? If there
Gianmario, Americans love Italy. Among European countries, they have a love-hate relationship with the British, obviously, for historical reasons. French, never really been all that keen on the French for historical reasons, the Germans for understandable reasons, but everybody loves Italy. Everybody loves Italy. So I think, interestingly, so when we saw the beginning of March, Italy being hit really hard and really seriously in a way, way beyond what any other European country, way beyond what anybody in Asia had suffered. Italy was the first, as Maurizio says, to really take the brunt of this surprise attack. I think there were two things going on. One, an enormous amount of sympathy for Italy and tremendous, expressions of concern about what was happening there. I have to also say there was a little bit of, Italy is an old country, that everybody was focused very hard on the demographics, the challenging demographics that you have as a country, the fact that there's a very high proportion of old people, maybe the healthcare system wasn't very strong. And there was a little bit of, I have to say, back in early March, well, that's not going to happen here because there are these very special considerations in Italy that make it a high level of smokers, bad, health habits, that kind of stuff, that made Italy particularly vulnerable. Well, then, of course, just weeks later, exactly what we'd all been looking at in Italy came and hit the United States, and in a very similar way, focused heavily, as I said, just as it was in northern Italy, here in the northeastern United States. Very quickly, the United States started to have enormous numbers of deaths a day, rising to overtake Italy. And I think there was a bit of people revisited what they thought and thought, well, maybe maybe it's not. Maybe Italy hasn't got special set of problems. This is more general. So I think that's caused people to rethink a little bit some of the assumptions that they had, that maybe the Italian healthcare system wasn't up to standard. There were a lot of reports in those early days here in the American press from places like Bergamo, which got a huge amount of attention. I know, of these terrible scenes of hospitals being overwhelmed by COVID-19 patients. And again, part of the message was, well, that couldn't happen here because we have more hospital beds, we have better standards of healthcare. Most of our, big cities are better equipped to deal with this. And there was a sense that this was peculiar to Italy. I do think now there's a better understanding that maybe there was more to it than this, and that Italy, while it's clearly still looks like, and by the way, then the story did change a little bit as we saw what happened in Spain, and we saw what happened in France, and of course, most recently, what's happened in the UK. So I think we went from thinking this is an Italian problem rooted in some very familiar Italian economic, social, and cultural challenges, to a realization that Italy was, to be honest, just the first to be hit by this, and that what came for Italy very soon came for the rest of us.
Sure. And Maurizio, were you surprised instead, as an outsider watching the US and UK particularly, about the fact that, for example, Boris Johnson first and then also Donald Trump minimized the problem, and then all of a sudden they realized that it was much, more important than they originally thought?
I have to admit, Gianmario, that first of all, I was surprised by how much slow was the reaction of mostly the European countries in giving full solidarity to Italy. We have to say it very openly, because we have to learn from the mistake of history. And in those first 2 or 3 weeks, when Italy was being hit very hard, the first statement that came out from Berlin, from Paris and from Brussels were not enough, were the wrong ones. And you see, I was remembering, I always ask myself, but how was possible that during the Second World War, they didn't know, they didn't pay attention, they were so slow to react? And in reality, it happened again. Italy was there, we were hit, and our European friends were not reacting, they were not understanding. It was really shocking for me. It was like to be part of that history again. This is what I felt. Then, of course, solidarity came. Yes, the right decisions came. Yes, the right statement. They gathered around Italy, and also the recent decision taken yesterday by the Commission was the right one. But it came very late in terms of solidarity. And this gave the opportunity to countries that are, yes, friends, but not allies of us, like China and Russia, to sneak in and to come to Italy and to spread all kinds of information especially against our link and relation with our European partners. This is what happened, and we have to say it very clearly, because all this came by mistakes that were committed by our friends. Now, was I surprised by the reaction of Boris Johnson? Yes. Was I surprised by the fight between President Trump and Anthony Fauci that I personally know? Very much so, because when he challenged Fauci, the reaction, not only mine, but many Italian people that were trusting the scientists so much in our country, was really, really shocked. But I believe that when we are going to read again what happened in these more than 2 months, really we have to start rethinking the relations among the European friends.
So thank you very much. I think that we are running out of time. So I would like to wholeheartedly thank our 2 guests that connected from New York and Rome. Jerry.
Thank you. Grazie.
Thank you.
Grazie
And Maurizio, we learned a lot of things. So basically, in terms of business model, I wrap up very briefly. In terms of business model, very positive, increasing number of subscription. Physical is not there at all, and possibly actually it will increase. Advertisement, we don't know. We'll see, according to the fact that, of course, there was a negative association to COVID during the pandemic. We have important trends also in terms of more fact-driven, of course, science, and more connection, of course, to the news. But in general, this pandemic has changed the way we are using work, even in the publishing industry. We have talked a lot about smart working and a lot about, of course, the different way we interact also inside the organization with journalists and with different, of course, opportunities for making the news. So I thank you very much, and I look forward to the next episode of
Thank you, Gianmario. Thanks, Maurizio.
Thank you, Jerry. Thank you, Gianmario.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.